So this week we're joined by Mike Covell, a local lad and a self-proclaimed author, historian, ripperologist and writer. So Mike, thanks for joining us. Could you please start by telling us a little bit about yourself, please?
Sure. My name's Mike. I was born and raised in Hull. I'm an East Hull lad. Lived in Hull all my life. I really sort of like the unknown. And it's always been sort of a passion. From the age of 8, I've always had sort of an interest in the unexplained and unsolved mysteries and unsolved crimes and this type of thing. So I guess I like to go and look between the lines. I like to go, see what's out there and see if there's any more information available and if we can fill in those gaps and try and solve some of those mysteries. And I guess that's it's like a full-time job now.
And how long have you been a writer for, and whom have you written for?
When I was at secondary school, I started writing fiction, and I did really well off the back of some of those stories. I managed to get all the grades I needed to be able to go into college and stuff like that. And then I kind of turned my back on writing, and normal life took over. And then 17 years ago, I was diagnosed with a critical heart condition. And to fill I had to give up full-time employment. So to fill my time, I used to write as just a way of relaxing and just zoning out, basically. And I used to read a lot. I mean, when the library was around the corner from the studio, I used to go to the library a lot and get a lot of books out and read a lot about local history. And I discovered that there were great big gaps in the knowledge of certain things. And amongst those were the paranormal in Hull, things like UFOs and ghost stories and things like that. True crime. I noticed that the true crime books that were published about all concentrated on the same few cases. And I knew from my own experiences there were a lot more true crime cases that no one had ever written about before. And Jack the Ripper. I discovered there were 14 suspects with links to Hull. There were a number of Jack the Ripper letters with links to Hull. So I started researching those and realised that I had enough information to write a book. And that was the plan, just to write a book while I was ill. And one book became 2 books, 2 became 4. At the minute, with my original publisher, I published 29 books. At the minute, I'm working on book number 100, and hopefully that'll be finished within the next 2 weeks.
How long does it take you to write a book, start to finish?
So what I do is, if you can imagine, say, like I'm writing a true crime book, it can be quite dark. When you're writing about child murders and women murders, it's a dark subject. So to lighten the load, I'll maybe start one at the same time about something a bit less serious, things like big cats or UFOs, and so I juggle. So when that project is getting dark, I'll give it a rest and do that one. So I'll often write 3 or 4 books at the same time, but it can take anywhere between a couple of weeks to a couple of years, depending upon the book and the subject. And a lot of the times the research is not readily available. So I go to London a lot, to the archives in London, the East Riding archives, the archives in Hull. And, obviously travelling around the country, meeting people, going to sites and stuff like that. So there's a lot of field work that goes into it, and people don't realise that. Like, most days I'll spend 14 hours just sat researching and going through the old newspapers and stuff, and people don't see that. People just think you just sit there and type and it all comes out, and it's not. A lot of it is obviously based on historical sources and old documents, old newspaper reports. So there's a lot of research that goes into it, so it all depends on the book, but I can do about 10,000 words a day. And most of my books are on average about 120,000 words.
And what's your latest book about?
Book number 100 is all about female murders in Hull between 1940 and the present day. So it's quite tough going. And the idea is that I want these to be records of these ladies, the lives these ladies had, and to show that when they were murdered in such brutal fashion, they weren't just sole victims. Their entire families and in many cases communities and things like that, they were victims too, and I want to be able to show that. And the idea behind those is when you talk to people about Hull and the darker side of the history of Hull, people get their information mixed up. They might get 2 or 3 cases mixed into one. They get things like names, dates, locations mixed up. So I want this to be a record, an accurate record, to show the true story behind these ladies' lives.
So, in your, I suppose, what we're going to do is, just to give you an idea, we're going to go through Hull's history, and then we're going to do Jack the Ripper a little bit, because I'm really interested in that. Then we're going to finish with the paranormal.
Brilliant.
So, to start, what stands out amongst Hull's history for you?
I think it's got to be the Second World War. Okay. I mean, the city was really, really hit badly, and we tend to forget that. We tend not to promote it or talk about it too much. The memorials that we have are kind of hidden away in the city. Several of the city buildings have bullet holes in, and they've just been glossed over, and we don't really talk about it. And when I do the World War II walking tours, at the end people are shocked. There's kind of a silent reference. People are like, wow, we never knew this. And it's just one of those things, and I think a lot of that is because at the time it was highly classified information. In the newspapers, Hull was referred to as a town in the northeast. Yeah. So now for researchers and archivists, when we look back on that period, we don't see Hull. We see a town in the northeast, which could be anywhere. So people just gloss over the fact that we were, really badly hit. So that is definitely an area that really interests me, and I think, it needs further study. And when I lecture about it, people are just blown away by it, and I find it fascinating.
Could you give us a sense of Hull history and sort of how it shapes the city today?
Yeah, definitely. One word I would say is their resilience, and use that word because when you go back through the town's history, we had things like the plague, we had things like the cholera, Hull flooded all the time. At one point there was a strange meteor shower where many of the old buildings set on fire because these meteors were hitting the buildings in the town. And then you come further along, you've got things like World War I, the Zeppelin raids, which flattened a large part of the city, not far from here actually. The Second World War, and then things like the total demolition of the trawling industry, the fishing industry. And every time we seem to get, and the most recent example was the Hull floods, every time that happens to us, we just kind of bounce back. We just kind of crack on with it, and I think that's amazing, and that just goes to show like the spirit of the people of Hull. But we have major events like that where most people would be, that's it, enough is enough. But the people of Hull just kind of crack on with it. We get on with it. So
they do, like I'm because of the nature of my research, I'm obsessed with the Second World War, and the history of the Second World War in the city really interests me, and I'm alarmed by the fact that no one really knows about it. There's obvious reasons for that, but I suppose I know we're skipping the gun here, but jumping the gun a little bit. But is there an association between Hull and the Second World War and the paranormal in Hull?
Oh, there has been, yeah, okay. Definitely. Not far from here, actually. Just opposite East Hull Baths. If you walk down onto Oldness Road, there's an old car lot, and it's covered in grass. It's overgrown. Many years ago, a gentleman who was working on St Stephen's when they was building that was cycling along Holderness Road, and he got a flat tyre, so he put his bike in the bush shelter. And while he was waiting, he could hear women and children crying. And he thought, I'm going to go and have a look, see what I can find. And he back then you could get onto that site. It was all open. And he put his light on his cycle and walked around the corner. And as he walked around the corner, he said the noise came to a crescendo and stopped. And he eventually got picked up by his wife. He got taken home. She sent me a message on social media. Can you have a word with him? Because he's sure he's witnessed something, but he's not sure what. And the date struck a chord with me because it was the anniversary of the bombing of Ellis Terrace. And Ellis Terrace was the terrace that stood on that spot. And there were 20 properties on that terrace. And everybody ran into the communal air raid shelter when the air raid sirens went off. And the shelter took a direct hit. And that entire community was wiped out. So in that, you had, if you can imagine, 20 families. But it wasn't just like today we think of a family like parents and kids. Back then, 3 or 4 generations lived together. So entire families was wiped off the face of the earth in that split second. And the official report says they were picking body parts up from the roof of East Hull Baths, which goes to show how far these guys went. And when I was able to say to him, right, this was the anniversary, you witnessed this, it blew him away. And no one's ever reported it since. No one's aired it since. And I'd love to go back on the anniversary, but it's all closed off now, so you can't. But yeah, I mean, that was fascinating for me because he knew nothing of it. He wasn't even from Hull. and didn't know anything about it. And even today, when we talk to people about Ellis Terrace, they're still unsure where it was. So for him to experience that on the spot was something else.
Yeah, I'm going to stick with the paranormal theme. Is there a connection between anniversaries of infamous events and paranormal sightings?
Oh, definitely, yeah. We have we get a lot of reports from people that experience stuff, things like births, marriages, deaths, especially quite tragic deaths.
Yeah.
We get kind of reports from people where they will experience more activity on those particular dates. Some buildings, people will say, "Oh, it's the most haunted building," but it doesn't happen all the time. You might get loads of activity all at once on a particular date, and then nothing happens for the rest of the year. And what I like to do is look for these dates and try and find the history behind them. And a great example was on Ferrens Way. If you know the corner of Springbank and Ferrens Way, there's the job centre.
Yeah.
And that was the old Shell Next building. And a lady came to me and she said, throughout the years, we went down into the basement, which was a filing room, and we saw this gentleman. And he walked up the stairs and he had black leather boots on, navy blue trousers, and he disappeared through a capped concrete ceiling. She said, "We'd love to know who he is." And again, I said, "Can you remember roughly what time of the year?" And she gave me the date. And I went away and researched it. And sure enough, 1941, the building took a direct hit. It was a parachute man. And when the air raid sirens went off, PC Garton, who was a police constable, ran up the stairs out onto Ferrens Way, opened up the doors of the shelter and shouted, "Come on, get in here." And a soldier was walking along Ferrens Way and he said, "I saw this flash and heard this bang. And when I looked across, the police officer was gone." And the official files actually say we looked for him and all we could find was bits of his black leather boots and bits of his navy blue trousers. So that was interesting. We got permission to go down there and film. And no one had ever filmed it before. It's on. You can see it on YouTube. While we were filming, it was really peaceful. But every time the camera stopped rolling, you could hear children running around. Yeah. And it just so happened that a lady called Susan Wood was in there with the 3 kids, and all 3 of them were killed. And it was really interesting because every time we got the camera on, it stopped. And it was so frustrating. You can see us on camera, really getting frustrated. Everything stops the minute we press record. But yeah, amazing building. Really, really interesting.
It got badly hit, that area, that Blundell's corner.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, well, it is a shame, but anyway, I suppose as a local lad, what are you most proud of from Hull's history? Well, about Hull's history?
God, there's so many stories. I mean, where do I start? When you talk about Hull's history, people always talk about the big names.
Yeah.
They talk about Wilberforce and Amy Johnson and people like that. But there's a lot of people that we don't really talk about as much. And many of them are just people from everyday life, and especially during the Second World War, pretty much everybody volunteered. And we forget that. We forget that these guys had full-time jobs and then went out on a night and helped clean up body parts and put out fires. And these were just normal people. And we forget about that and the sacrifice that they made as well. So it's people like that. I mean, one of the guys that I was researching recently was a doctor during the Second World War. And it was his job to do all the inquests on the victims. And I mean, if you can imagine, there was over 1,200 and odd deaths in Hull. We still don't know the exact number because things like Ellis Terrace, they were coming away with buckets of body parts. Mm. So we still don't know the exact number. So can you imagine being the coroner, the doctor in charge of all... I mean, it must have been awful. Yeah. And he was called Dr. Norman Jennings, and he was just a normal doctor that was in Hull during the Second World War and got dragged into this bloodbath, basically. And he was such a noble man, and he fought for things as well. He fought for better lighting in Hull at the time. Obviously, we had the blackouts. He fought for things like pavements getting painted, and as far as on the outskirts of Hull, he was one of the people that said, "Look, when we go out on a night in these blackouts, we're going out with vehicles that have no headlights. We're going to crash into things in the country." And one of his ideas at the time was to paint cows white. With white, so we would see them, and they did that. Beverly Westwood, all the cows had white stripes on, so that drivers on an evening could see him. And he was so clever, and he was so vocal throughout. And he was an amazing guy. Robert Tarrant was the guy involved with Tarrant Industries. He was involved. He was the chief air raid warden, so he was involved with all the shelters and things like that. And he made his entire workforce volunteer. And towards the end of his life, he was accused of financial irregularities. and as such, we don't remember him. You know, and there was so many people like that were instrumental, and we tend to forget about them because we concentrate on those big names and don't really talk about the little names.
Yeah.
We're going to move on to Jack the Ripper.
Okay.
Because I feel like there's a lot to cover. What's the connection between Hull and Jack the Ripper?
So, well, you think about geographically, Hull was the third port at the time. So Hull, London and Liverpool were the three main ports in the country. So there was always a worry when Jack the Ripper hit London in 1888 that perhaps he could come to Hull. So that was one of the big things at the time. There were 14 suspects with links to Hull, from people that were born here, who visited here, who came here to work, who came here to commit crimes and so on. There was Ripper letters sent to Hull, there was Ripper letters sent from Hull, and there were Ripper letters sent mentioning Hull. And many of them sort of said, look, you know, it's the major port that we're going to go to and this, that and the other. But as well, during that period, there was also a number of Ripper scares where people were being assaulted with all sorts, from broom handles to bits of wood. And at that time, any female getting assaulted, it would appear in the newspaper archive, Jack the Ripper scare and things like that. And then when you go into the archives and look at the police reports, it will say things like, you know, they were just drunk. So there was lots of things like that. So there were lots of links between Hull and the Jack the Ripper case. You know, the suspects are fascinating.
Will we ever actually know who Jack the Ripper was?
No. I think at the minute there's over 300 suspects, and they range from royalty to poets, painters, police officers, members of parliament, all the way down to some of the funniest ones I've heard was Queen Victoria. Pretty much everyone would know what she looked like because she was on the money. An escaped baboon from a local circus. And then a few years ago, a movie came out where they claimed the culprit was none other than the Loch Ness Monster. So there have been some rather unusual suspects over the years.
Is there a Jack the Ripper equivalent in Hull?
I suppose the closest we'd come to was James Gray in 1900. James Gray was... He was accused in the newspapers of being like Jack the Ripper.
Yeah.
And he basically ran from one end of Beverley Road to the other and stabbed 5 women in the buttocks. And because he used a knife and because it was 5 women, he was linked in with the Jack the Ripper case. And the strange thing about James Gray, a year before that, he'd done it in Doncaster. He'd ran from Doncaster Racecourse to Doncaster Railway Station and stabbed 5 women in the bum. And then I think he got 9 months in prison for that. Before that, he was in Chesterfield and did the same thing there. And they gave him a few months in prison. So it was prolific. He was a repeat offender, but the biggest sentence they could give him was just 9 months. So he would go to prison and come back out and do it all again.
That's a bizarre way to lead your life, isn't it?
Exactly, yeah. He was a knife grinder by trade, so he had access to the tools.
Why did Jack the Ripper capture the popular imagination so much? And why does he still capture the imagination so much?
I think it's because of the unknown. I think because... well, there's a couple of things. I mean, one of them is the era, that period. Okay. People love Victorian history. People have a fascination with true crime. You only have to look at things on Netflix and stuff to see there is a fascination with true crime. The fact that we didn't know who he was, I think, you know, and the press at the time gave him that name, Jack the Ripper. And I think that name just evokes so many visions and, you know, who was this guy? Why was he doing it? Why did he suddenly stop? We just don't know. There's so many different theories.
Before we move on to the paranormal, could you just explain to our listeners what a Ripper letter is, please?
So during 1888, hundreds of letters were sent to the police, to the press, and to various other figures. And these all claimed to be from Jack the Ripper. Mm. Some of them mentioned dates, places, times, things he was going to do. Some of them talked about previous attacks. Some of them talked about, you know, religion and lighting and all different things. Some of them were handwritten. Some of them were painted. Some of them were drawn with pencils. Some of them had sketches of skull and crossbones on. At the time, on average, it said they were receiving about 200 to 300 letters a day. And through research that I've done, we've discovered that it's not just in London. Ripper letters were getting sent all over the country. There was a lady in Bradford arrested for writing Ripper letters. and she would send them to her boss and the police and things like that, just taunting them. And they found out that she was sending Ripper letters, and I think she got a few months in prison for that.
Didn't one letter get sent with half an organ?
That's right, yeah. There was a kidney that was sent to a gentleman called George Lusky, who was head of the Whitechapel Vigilance Committee. But again, they were in two minds whether or not the kidney belonged to a victim or whether or not... Because back then, the medical schools in London, there was quite a lot of them, so people could have access to things like kidneys. Yeah. But yeah, unfortunately, the kidney was in the Royal London Hospital Archives, and it's since disappeared, so we can't even test it or do anything like that to see where it came from.
It's a shame. That contributes to the Ripper mythology.
The mythology, yeah.
Mythology.
Everything's disappeared.
Yeah. So I suppose it's not much of a shame. It's it kind of boosts the...
Oh yeah, definitely, definitely. But again, there's kind of a weird side to Ripperology as well, because it does attract a few people that are not quite all there, and you do get people coming out and saying, "Oh, we've got access to it. We've got evidence that our granddad was Jack the Ripper," and all this kind of stuff. So you do get people coming out with outlandish theories based on missing evidence.
Yeah.
So.
Right. So speaking of the unknown, the paranormal.
Yeah. Can you explain how the paranormal reveals itself in Hull?
Yeah, I mean, wow, we've got so many weird and wonderful stories. Hull has a wonderful collection of allegedly haunted buildings, so there's lots of ghost stories. Going back to the 1850s, when there was a allegedly haunted house on Anlaby Road. So there's stories like that. The paranormal is such a broad term, so things like cryptozoology fall under that. So I don't know if you remember in the 90s there was sightings of big cats. They called it the wild cat of the walls that was seen in the villages around Hull. During the 20s and 30s, there were sea monsters that were seen in the Humber. And then you can look at things like ufology. 1801 was the first UFO sighting in Hull of this craft that dropped over the Humber, split into 4 parts, rejoined together and flew off. And it shrouded the city in blue light at the time. So that was really interesting. So there's so many different aspects of the paranormal, but the most popular one are the ghosts. People love ghost stories. We're coming up to sort of that time of the year when people really get into it. So I mean, people like to be scared. I think people like to sort of live on the edge and go through that experience.
What's going on with this Humber sea monster? And I didn't know anything about the UFO sighting, so could you just give us a little bit about that as well, please?
We'll go to the Humber monster then. Okay. A few years ago, I was researching a book on the Humber monster, and I'd found a series of newspaper reports in the Hull Daily Mail archives from the 20s and 30s talking about these sea serpent sightings, and there was hundreds between Whitby and the Humber, hundreds of sightings along the East Yorkshire coast. But on the Humber itself, people were seeing these weird creatures, but they weren't just normal people that were seeing them. They were fishermen and trawlermen. These were guys that were used to what was in the sea. They were used to seeing things on the Humber, and they were coming back and saying, "Oh, we've seen this creature and it's got eyes like headlamps on a car and all this kind of stuff." So I wrote about this as an historical piece, but the way the media works, that the Nationals picked up on the story. And they came up with a story that they said Mike is the head of the Humber Monster Watch and patrols on an evening. And people started contacting me saying, can we join? Can we? And I was like, seriously, I've got better things to do with my time than stand on Victoria Dock. Because the story came out just before sort of the autumn period. And I was like, I can think of better things to do in autumn in Hull than walk up and down the Humber on an evening looking for a monster that hasn't been seen for 70 odd years. So that was really interesting. The UFO sighting, I was writing a book on Hull UFO cases, and I was just in the archives looking for stuff to do with astronomy and Hull. And I found this newspaper report that was published in all the newspapers, and it was from 1801, and it said basically there was a serene blue light, like a comet, had flown towards Hull, and people came out to look at it, and it just stopped and split into 4 and kind of hovered over the city for a while. And everyone was out in the streets looking at it, and everyone was bathed in this weird blue glow, and then it came back together and flew off. Now, if it was a comet, it wouldn't have stopped. It would have kind of gone, and if it had split, it would have split and carried on going. But this thing came back together, and we can't explain it. it was published at the time in astronomy magazines and newspapers and journals and periodicals, and loads of people were talking about it. It's never been solved. We don't know what it was. And usually when you go into the archives, you can find celestial activity from comets and things like that goes some way in explaining a lot of these sightings. But that particular one it's baffling. And again, that one went viral. That was mentioned all over the UK. A friend of mine contacted me. He was Polish, and he said, "Mike, you're in the Polish newspapers." And it was really funny because I couldn't understand a word except for Mike Covell and the word Hull. And it was really weird because it had gone all over the world.
That's crazy. That it goes. I mean, it's a nice thing for the city as well. You know, as well as for yourself.
Yeah, well, we had quite a lot of cynical people saying because a lot of these stories came out in 2015, 2016, because that was when I was working as a freelance writer, and people were saying, just in time for the city of culture, you know, and they thought it was all part, and I was like, it's not part of that. Yeah. Like, I've got nothing to do with that. This is these are stories that I've uncovered, and because it's my job to do this, I'm just bringing them to the public's attention. The biggest one we did was the Beast of Barmston Drain, which was this werewolf sighting that was seen on Barmston Drain. And this was in 2015. A guy contacted me and said he'd seen a black-eyed ghost kid on Skullcoats Lane. So I
used to live there.
So did you?
Yeah.
Not far from the cemetery.
Yeah.
So, and he asked me if anyone had any weird experiences. So I put a post on social media, and it said, "Has anyone had a strange experience on Skullcoats Lane?" And within the space of 7 hours, 7 individuals contacted me and said, "Do you know about the Beast?" And I said, "What is the Beast?" And they said it's a shape-shifting werewolf that lives on Barmston Drain. Now, I don't believe in werewolves, but at the time, the Hull Daily Mail said to me, "Will you go and investigate?" And I said, "Yeah, sure." And I went down to Barmston Drain. We didn't find anything, nothing remotely werewolfy. And I wrote an article for them in 2015, and overnight it went viral. And it was in all the major newspapers. Alice Cooper put a post on his blog saying he wanted to come to Hull to look for the werewolf. We filmed with Discovery Channel, Travel Channel. We had the media ascent. You know, it was just crazy. And every time it seemed to settle down, another witness would come forward, and the story would start up again. And I was doing interviews I did Australia, New Zealand. At one point, I had an interview in Japan. And I'm sat there on the phone, like, thinking no one in Japan is going to understand my accent. They're not going to know what Barmy Drain and Scully Lane is and all this kind of stuff. And it was just so surreal. And then just, on the back of that, we had people getting dressed up, going around town as a werewolf. And the BBC got involved. We did loads of filming together and stuff like that. And it blew out of proportion. It was crazy. At Adelphi, they had a music show from a group called Black Cats, who did the Beast about Barmston Drain, rock operetta. I was invited along to that, and I got on stage and told the story. In Cardoma 94, they had a life-size statue of a werewolf that they'd put in the auditorium and stuff like that. And then most recently, there's a beer. You can get the Beast of Barmston Drain beer. So it's really, like, crazy, you know.
Where can you get that?
Well, I saw a guy buy some on Prinny Ave. He put a post on Twitter. And said, "Look, I've got some Beast of Barmston Drain beer."
We'll have some of that. Yeah.
I've been trying to get hold of some because I just thought that'd be nice for the archive.
It would,
sit in my office.
Yeah. When you get thirsty, you can have a little.
Exactly. Yeah.
Does the Bubblegum Boy or Seven Alleys mean anything to you?
It certainly does. Yeah. So the Bubblegum Boy was a story I researched. Again, way back in 2015. That was the first story that I pitched to the Hull Daily Mail. When they'd offered me a job as a freelance writer. And I was like, yeah, sure, I don't have to go into the office. I can work from home. Fantastic.
Drinking your beer.
Yeah. So they sort of said to me, what ideas have you got? And I said, right, there's a story in East Hull, and it's called The Bubblegum Boy. And as children, we were told never to swallow bubblegum because it wraps around your heart. And this little boy is evidence of that. And as a kid growing up, you realise physiologically that can't happen. And I put a post on social media saying, does anyone know about the Bubblegum Boy? And people said, we believe he would. Obviously, the big story was that he swallowed the bubblegum. But then someone said, he got run over by a train. He got run over by a tram. He drowned in Holderness Drain. So I went to Eden Road Cemetery, found the grave, peeled away the moss, and his name was Alfie Middleton. And with that information, I went to the archives and found out he was a 14-year-old boy that died of meningitis. And over the years, the locals had created this kind of cautionary tale. So I wrote the article, and his family actually got in touch, and they're still living in Hull. And they were so thankful. They were like, thank you for remembering the real story behind the boy. And I actually, that weekend, I took him to the grave, which was wonderful to see them all around.
Did they know where it was?
No, they've never been before.
That's bizarre, isn't it?
The dad actually said to me, his father has worked in Hull Prison, which is right next to the grave itself. Yeah. And his father had passed away many, many years ago when he was a young boy. And he remembers the ashes being scattered on the grave. And he'd not been back since. So that was quite emotional to be able to show him that. And we used that in 2017 during the City of Culture year. We had the thing in East Park. And they released big white balloons to commit. It was sort of like a commemoration of Alfie. And they released them for the Bubblegum Boy. And then Seven Alleys was adjacent to the prison and the cemetery. And it was basically an alleyway that twists and turns 7 times. But locally, it had this kind of... people would say, like, we bet you dare go down 7 Alleys. And as a kid, you'd be terrified because they'd tell you these ghost stories of people that were all black and sooty. And they said that these came from the Second World War because Eden Road was actually bombed. And what happened in Second World War was the victims of the bombing were buried in Eden Road. And then the Germans flew over and dropped on them again. Oh. So they were blown out the grave. So there was these stories of these people all black and charred, all covered in dust and soot. And they would come down 7 Alleys and follow you, and the White Lady would follow you. And as kids, we used to be terrified. But then as teenagers, when we went to David Lister, which was the school right next to it, on a lunchtime we'd be right, let's go and find the White Lady and, you know, all these guys. And we'd walk around 7 Alleys. And sadly, it's all gone now. It's been knocked down and replaced by Hull Prison. So...
Oh, so, like, that way?
Yeah, not far from here,
people listening won't know what that is, but I know what you mean. Like,
so,
by the docks.
It almost runs parallel to Headham Road.
Yeah.
Behind Hull Prison, behind the Headham Road Cemetery, and what would have been the Headham Road Maternity Hospital. Yeah.
I think everywhere's got a white lady story. Because my dad, he grew up in Belfast, but he went to school in Lisbon. So Lisbon it's not in Portugal, by the way, it's just south of Belfast. And as kids, he'd take us to this big house and he'd say, just look in that window there and you'll see the White Lady, and you'd swear you see someone moving by, wouldn't you? But getting down to the nitty-gritty, like the real interesting stuff here, have you ever sighted a ghost or experienced a spirit in Hull?
Yes.
Okay, could you please tell us about that?
Needless. Just off Schoolcoats Lane. I used to work there as a young lad.
Yeah.
When I was about 19, 20, I worked in there. And I remember what we used to do, I used to work the night shifts, and several things had happened. Stuff had gone missing, things had moved, we'd seen stuff move. So there was always talk of the property being haunted. And I used to help this guy called Bernard, and Bernard in the morning after we'd finished our shift used to take all the toffee, put it in a big machine, and it'd all get melted down and recycled and reused, so nothing went to waste. But he was quite old and not in the best of health. So when he took the trolley with all the toffee on, I used to feel sorry for him. So I'd say, go on, Bernard. And I'd push the trolley and he'd pull the trolley. And we were up on the 3rd floor. And loads of people had said, like, nobody dare go on the 3rd floor. The 3rd floor is, like, super active. So on a night, I'd go up there on my own looking around. And, you know, it never bothered me in the slightest. And I remember it was the middle of summer. It was a beautiful day. The sun was rising, so the building was full of light. It wasn't dark. It wasn't like gothic and spooky or anything like that. He was pulling, I was pushing, and I heard him shout, "What are you doing in here?" And I sort of looked at him, and he was looking over my shoulder, and I turned, and this guy was stood behind us about 20 feet away, and he just totally ignored us, and he ran. But as he ran, he came into the sort of, if you can imagine, all these pallets. He was behind the pallet, so we can see his top half. And he ran into the corridor where I stood, and he was floating. It just didn't appear to have legs. And he just hovered. So Bernard was like, that guy's just broke in. So me and him ran after this stranger. And even now the hairs on the back of my neck are standing up because I can remember him so vividly. He was dressed in brown overalls. And because it's a factory, you have these kind of mirrors on the corners for the forklift drivers so they can see around the corner. And I remember running and looking at the mirror and seeing him gliding up. And he went through a set of double doors, and we followed him through those. And the double doors in Needless had circular windows, so you could see who was approaching, you know, to avoid vehicles hitting each other. And so we saw him go through these, and the next set of double doors were locked, and he just went straight through them.
Oh. And
at that point, I turned to Bernard, and I was like, that guy didn't have any legs. And Bernie was like, yeah, he was hovering. And I was like, so why are we chasing him? Why are we running after this guy?
Yeah.
You know, like, that to me is not normal. Yeah. And I remember getting in the lift, and your adrenaline's pumping. I think it was like 6 o'clock in the morning. It was just before we finished shift. And I remember, like, absolutely just like, what was that? How can you explain that? And like, your belief systems are all, and you shook up because you've seen so many horror movies. Things could have gone. You could have been dragged off with him and all this kind of stuff. And I remember we dropped onto the bottom floor, and there was this Scottish fella, and he saw us running out the lift, and he said, in a real broad Scottish accent, he just sort of said the words, "It's an unspeakable evil." But because he was Scottish, it came across quite comic. Yeah. And I mean, we just burst out laughing. And he was like, "You've seen it, haven't you?" And we was like, "Yeah." And he was like, "Yep." He said, "Welcome to the club." He said, "Quite a lot of us have seen it, and that's why none of us will go back up there."
Oh my God.
But yeah, that was... Because it just looked real. It just looked like a real person. But that was the first sighting that I had. And that was the thing that made me think, yeah, maybe there is something, on the other side.
Why did you chase after it?
Well, we thought it broke in.
Okay.
I always say to people, think normal before paranormal, think natural before supernatural. We thought this guy was a robber, robbing recycled toffee, but still. And I mean, looking back on it now, it seems so bizarre. But me and Bernard was like, right, let's get this guy. And I mean, I dread to think what would have happened if
old man
would have caught up with this. What we rugby tackle him. He's got no legs. So weird.
Where are the most haunted places in Hull?
So, one of the locations that I love to visit is Royal Station Hotel on Ferrens Way. It's a place where I've never not had a quiet night. There's always something that's gone off. Amongst the weirdest experiences, we were in the cellar. We were stood around a table with a candle, and there was 14 people stood around the table, and it was pitch black. No electricity down there, no nothing, and really dark, but the candle's flickering away. And it's a small room, smaller than this, with one door and one door. That door's the exit. That door over there leads into a bit more darkness. And we're stood around the room, and I'm looking around, and I'm thinking, there's 15 people here. And there was this really tall guy, and I'm like, did you come down with the other group? And he sort of looked at me and back, and everybody sort of looked at him, and he looked at us and backed off into the darkness and disappeared. And everybody panicked. But trying to get 14 people outside one door, everybody just kind of got wedged, and when people are nervous, they giggle, they cry, they scream, trying to get everyone shepherded out and headed out. No idea who this guy was, he just kind of vanished, and that was freaky. On another occasion, I was in the reception upstairs, so when you first walk into Royal Station Hotel, you've got the bar at that side, the reception, and in the corner there's kind of like a tea room. And I saw this boy come out of the tea room, and he was dressed in kind of a real nice posh blue suit with a little hat on, and he had his hand in his pocket, sort of stood there like that. And I said to Ray, the duty manager, I said, "Ray, there's one of your staff, and I think he wants you." And Ray looked over, and he was like, "You didn't work here." So again, I think this kid's broke in. So there was myself, there was Ray, I think we had the night watchman, security guard, there was the guy who goes around making sandwiches for people, the receptionist. There was about 10 of us, all big strapping fellas. We all chased after this kid thinking he'd broke in. He ran down the back corridor and went straight through a wall. And at that point, all of us refused to leave each other's side for the rest of the night.
Is this the hotel next to Paragon Interchange?
Yeah, the hotel right next to the station. So, and I remember thinking at one point, I remember saying, right, just going to pop to the toilet, lads. And all the rest of them said, yeah, we're coming with you. Because none of them would go on their own. They all wanted to wait. And it was really surreal seeing all these big strapping lads absolutely terrified. And then on another occasion, we'd gone into the basement, and the basement of Royal Station Hotel goes from the front of the hotel all the way under the platforms. It's really, really long. And there's a single corridor which has lights at the front, but at the back end it's darkness. So psychologically, when you're going from the light to the dark, it plays, you're always thinking that. And I would say to clients, don't look at the dark. If you get worried, look back at the light. And it helps, because you can see that bright light. And I was with this guy, and he worked on reception, and he was like, will you take me down? Loads of people have been down. I've never been down. I'd love to go and look. And I was like, yeah, sure. So I took him down, and we're walking along, and he's getting a bit, jittery and getting a bit scared. So I keep saying, look at the light. So he's looking back, and we carry on walking. He's looking back, and we carry on walking. And we get into the really, really dark bit. And I sort of say to him, right, from now on, I'm going to switch my torch on because it's really dark. Obviously, for health and safety reasons, I don't want you falling over in the dark. And with that, he looked back at the light and he screamed. And I remember he grabbed my arm so hard he bruised my arm. And I was like, what the heck is going on? And he said, I've just seen the Slender Man. Now, the Slender Man's a fictional character,
yes,
right?
I know the Slender Man.
So he said to me, can you take me back upstairs? But the problem is, whatever he'd seen was blocking our passage. So I'm like, I will, but bear in mind, whatever it is you've seen is supposedly up there.
Yeah.
So we walked back up, and he would not let go of my arm. He was like gripping me, and I got him back up to the reception. And he said to me, just give me a second. And he went over to the reception, took his keys out, put them on the top. He went to the bar and ordered a double, rang a taxi and said, that's it, I'm quitting. And I said, before you go, tell me what you've seen. Like, describe it. And he just described him as being a gentleman with a top hat. And I said, that's more like a Victorian gentleman.
Yeah.
But because he'd, obviously been brought up on TV shows and comics and things like that, that was what he, said it was. It was a Slender Man. But that was, he was crying and shaking and everything, and he was quite dramatic about it all, and I was sort of laughing, and never seen anything like this before, and it was amazing to see him quit his job over something like that. And I said to him, you never even have to go down there. Why are you quitting your job? Like, you'd never have to go in that basement. You're only there because you've asked me to take you. And he was like, I don't care. It's in the same building. So, and that was it. It's left.
That invites me to ask 2 questions, yeah. 1, are there any telltale signs of paranormal activity? And secondly, is it possible for a ghost or a spirit to be malevolent?
Yeah. So in terms of signs and stuff like that, you often find things getting moved, things disappearing, things reappearing where they shouldn't be, and things like that. Strange smells, knocks, taps, that kind of stuff. They're like the most common aspects when we go to locations that people have reported.
Yeah.
In terms of the differences, a few years ago I did some stuff in in Hull New Theatre, and I was sat in Royal Box B. So when you're at the theatre, Royal Box B is like the one that's just up on the right hand side. And we had a camera set up in the box filming me, and I was on my own, and the rest of my team were in the bar watching on a screen. And I had an earpiece, and they were saying, right, go and sit in the box. So I'm sat in the box and ask out, is there anyone there? So, is there anybody here? And I could hear footsteps. And I opened the door and looked in the corridor, and there was no one there. But I was rationalising it, because sometimes if people walk on Jarrett Street, you can hear them inside. So I ignored that, and I closed the door, asked out again, is there anyone there? And I could hear scratching. But again, I'm thinking, right, I've just opened and closed that door. Maybe the wood is settling. So I'm not panicking too much. And the other thing is as well, if it kicks off, if you jump off the edge of Royal Box B, it's about 20 feet down into the auditorium, so you're going to break your legs.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to remain calm.
Yeah.
So they're like, right, ask out again. So I said, if there's anyone here, give us a sign. And I heard a noise in the box with me, but because it's so dark, you can't see your hand in front of your face. So in my earpiece, I could hear them all cheering. And I'm like, what's going on? And they're like, a chair has just moved in front of you. And I'm like, no way. And they're like, yeah. Ask out again. Like, is that not enough? So I said, right, if there's anyone here, give me another sign. And the only way I can describe it is if you stood there and someone comes up behind you and blows on your neck.
Ooh.
And it felt like someone had come up to talk to me and blew on my neck. And I just said, right, that's it. I'm done. Come and get me. Like, that is too close for comfort. And I remember I went down into the bar area, took all the equipment off me, switched all the cameras off, and I went to the urinal, and I was stood in the urinal, and a guy was stood next to me from the team, and he said, what's going on with your neck? And I said, what do you mean? And he pulled my collar down, and I had 3 big scratch marks right down my neck. But they were like the kind of scratches where they swell.
Yeah.
And for about 2 or 3 weeks, they wouldn't go down. They was massive. And I didn't go back to Hull New Theatre for a year. That really affected me. That really scared me, because I thought that's quite physical.
Yeah.
And I remember the first night we went back, I remember walking in. I walked into the bar, I dropped my bags on the floor, went, see you later, guys, and I locked myself in Royal Box B for an hour, and nothing happened. So, and I had to do that for myself because I thought if I don't do it, I'll be forever scared of that building.
Yeah.
So,
Well, why do spirits hang around or where? Like, what invites them? I don't know how to phrase the question really, but why are they here?
I think a lot of it's unfinished business.
Okay.
A lot of it is they're scared to cross over. You know, if they've done things in life that they're not particularly proud of, they're worried that they're going to go to hell and all that kind of stuff. So we found a lot of people they're afraid to cross over, and on some occasions we found that they've got a problem that needs to be solved. They need recognition or something like that. Have you ever heard about my house?
No.
So it's been in the newspapers and stuff like that. So I moved into my house just on 7th Street, just off Oldham's Road, a week before the Hull floods. Within a couple of days, my eldest woke up and he was screaming. And he said to me, there's a man at my door and he has a bit of wood and he bangs it in his hand. And I was like, okay. And then my little girl, I was tucking her into bed and she said, Daddy, where's the old lady that sings songs to us?
Oh.
And I was like, there is no old lady. And she went, there is, Dad. She comes and tucks us in bed and sings to us. I was like, no, there isn't. And then one night my eldest woke up and he was screaming. I mean, he was terrified. And I ran into his room and I said, what's the matter? And he wouldn't tell me. He was shaking his head. So I went to hug him. And as I hugged him, he moved his head really close up to me. And he whispered in my ear and he said, he's behind you. And I remember I pooed myself, you know, I'm not going to lie.
Yeah.
I remember turning around and looking and there was no one there and I'm thinking, what is going on? So I went to the archives. Probably the biggest mistake ever.
Yeah.
I found this
For sale.
I found this report, which I've got on my tablet. I can show you before we finish. It said murder on 7th Street and I thought, oh, fantastic. I'll print it off and all the neighbours. You know, I can have a chat with the neighbours over a cup of tea. Great conversation piece. And I followed the story through the press. And eventually I found one and it said Hull woman murdered, bloodstained axe found near body, and in the body of the report it said at 44 my house. And basically what happened on April 1st 1945, Fred Watson, who was a fitter and a lodger, came home from work and put an axe through Mrs. Garbutt's head 6 times in what is today my living room. He dragged the body into the back room, which is now my office, and he switched the gas taps on. That failed. He tried to cut his wrists. That failed. The police arrested him and took him to the hospital on Beverley Road. And he escaped and ran into town. And back then, Norfolk Street Police Station was there, so the police officers ran and arrested him. They took him back to the hospital. They patched him up, sent him to the police court, declared him guilty but insane, sent him to the asylum, and as soon as he got to the asylum, he cut his throat. So I've got a suicide and a murder connected to the property. But then I thought, where's her husband? Why is her husband not living with her? So I went further back in the archives. Mr. Garbutt left the property in 1929. He was never seen alive again. It looked like he'd been beat up and thrown in the Humber. They pulled his body out near Grimsby. So I've got a murder, a suicide, and a suspicious death. So I ended up getting the priest from the Diocese of York, sent a priest. And I remember he came to the house. He looked like Paul Weller, which was hilarious. He said to me, don't tell me anything about your property. And he walked to the bottom of the stairs and he stood there for a minute and he said, there's a man at the top of the stairs with an axe, he wants to kill you all. So I said, he can go.
Get rid of him.
He said, there's a little old lady. She likes it. She's really protective. I said, she can stay. Sometimes we get like the smell of lavender or perfume. Just recently, I had a film crew come and film and we were in the office and they were just asking about Book 100. You know, how's the writing going? How's the research going? Asking about plans and stuff for the future. And at that moment, the director just said, can I just quickly ask about Mrs. Garbutt? And as he said the word Garbutt, a folder flew off and landed near his feet. And I was like, is that enough for you?
Yeah.
You know, and I remember I was just sat there quite chilled, like, well, that's a bit weird. And I could see them behind the camera, like, you know, like really panicking and stuff like that. And they were like, we're going to have to cut and talk about this because, you know, and it was weird. It was weird. But it's not like scary. It's not like in the horror films where... I mean, the past week I've been home alone. I've stayed home alone. I've got a cat. He's real chilled out. I have all my equipment. Sometimes I set my equipment up and stuff, but it don't bother me in the slightest. I find it really relaxing and, yeah, it's a nice place.
Well, to finish, we've got 2 questions that we ask all of our guests. Do you want to go ahead and say the first one?
Yeah, sure. Mike, how would you describe a Hullensian to somebody who isn't from Hull?
Someone with spirit. Someone who's a bit cheeky, because I do think we have this wicked sense of humour in Hull. someone who's friendly, because I do think we are a big friendly city, and someone who likes chips, base and pies. But yeah, I think pretty much that's...
And what does Hull mean to you?
Oh, it's home. Yeah, definitely. I remember years and years ago, I lectured in London, and a gentleman stopped me and he said to me, "Hull, isn't that at the end of the line?" And I said, "No, actually." I said, "It's at the beginning."
I like the way you spun that.
Yeah.
I'm going to start using that.
Yeah.
Because funnily enough, people do say to me, Hull is 40 miles away from everywhere else.
Yeah.
And I suppose, yeah, in a sense it is, but that by no means diminishes its importance or its ability.
Definitely. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Mike.
But yeah, thanks for coming on. It's been a pleasure.